Good morning, everyone. I played in the third round of the George O'Rourke Memorial last night in Fishburg, Mass. And I had the white pieces against Mike Commisso, who's rated 1728. Coming into this game, each of us had a score of 2 out of 2, and we were playing on board 1. I had the white pieces, and I led with d4. He played d5, and after my c4 he played knight c6, which is the Chigorin defense. I don't think I've ever faced this in an over-the-board game, and couldn't really remember what I was supposed to do, but I was pretty sure the next move's knight c3, developing a piece and adding to my control of the d5 square, maybe threatening now to actually take that pawn. Mike played knight f6, which I think is a good move, and here I played a move that's maybe not so hot. I played c takes d5. And it's not a bad move, it's just that I think white normally plays knight f3 here, because in the c takes d5 variation, black gets a chance to play e5, challenging white in the center and avoiding ending up in the kind of martial defense type of situation that Mike and I got in the game. I played c takes d5, knight takes d5, and then I played e4. And my thought was that if Mike captures on c3, then after b takes c3, we have a Grunfeld pawn structure, except that black's going to have a harder time playing c5, which I thought should mean that white has a more significant advantage than he does in the Grunfeld. But I think black can just play knight takes c3, b takes c3, e5. And this is the reason white, I think, often plays knight f3 a little bit earlier. Mike instead played knight b6, and now this is really starting to resemble an opening called the Marshall, which goes d4, d5, c4, knight f6. And the difference between this and Grunfeld type of positions is that after c takes d5, knight takes d5, when white eventually plays e4, which he usually doesn't immediately, so knight f3 is often played first and then e4. The black knight will not have anything to capture on c3 and will for that reason have to retreat, which means that there are more minor pieces on the board, which amplifies white's advantage because of his extra space. So Mike should have taken on c3 here and played e5, I think, but he played knight b6, so I continued in the style of the Marshall defense, advancing my pawns in the center and taking a bunch of space, with the idea that I'll develop my pieces behind that, and even if black eventually breaks down the center, my pieces will be so active that I'll retain an advantage. Knight e5 from Mike, f4 taking more space, knight g6. And I guess at this point it's my opinion that white has a pretty significant advantage, but it didn't turn out to take very many moves for Mike to equalize the game and maybe have an edge himself. So I think I have to look for an improvement here somewhere. I played knight f3, which is hard to disagree with, but maybe it was possible to play e5 here, as strange as that looks, with the idea that the knight doesn't have anywhere to go except back to e5, and then I can play bishop to f4, threatening it. And black has 3 options. One is f6, but after bishop takes f6, bishop takes e6, f takes e6, queen h5 check, black should be in serious trouble. So he'd either have to play queen d6 or move the knight, and queen d6 looks pretty awkward to me, as it walks into a pin on this diagonal. So I think black would have played knight e to c4. And I believe during the game I rejected this variation because black's knight is coming back to d6 and putting pressure on white's center. But this may just be a way for white to keep all of his extra space and continue playing with an advantage. Because what I did in the game is after knight f3 and Mike's, I think, very strong e6, beginning to challenge my center, is play queen d4. Normally you can't put a queen in the center of the board early in the game because it gets harassed by the opponent's pawns and minor pieces. But when you can do it, it tends to be pretty strong. And so here I thought, well, Black's knight is nowhere near the c6 square. So I can put my queen on d4 and control some important central squares and maybe tie Black's dark squared bishop down to the defense of the g-pawn. I realized at the time that at some point a Black knight might end up on d7, and this is a lot of confusing nonsense. Let's get rid of that. And if I've castled by that point, he may be able to play bishop c5, winning my queen. So I was worried about that, but I didn't like the alternatives very much. I think there were two things I was looking at. One is bishop to b5 check, and what was the other one? Bishop to e3. Bishop e3 develops the dark squared bishop, which turns out to have a hard time developing in the game. So, you know, it would be a good idea to get it out a little bit earlier. But I think after e takes d5, and queen e7, this pin might cost me my f4 pawn or cause me problems with development or with the safety of my king. So I didn't like bishop e3, and I was thinking about bishop to b5 check, which would likely have been responded to with bishop to d7, but then Black's queen isn't putting pressure on my d-pawn, and I would have retreated my bishop somewhere, either d3 or e2, just claiming that Black's position is slightly worse with the bishop on d7 than with it on c8. What I missed and saw right after I played queen d4 is that maybe I have bishop to b5 check, bishop d7, and d takes e6. And now if Black retakes on e6 with his f-pawn, he has a couple of weaknesses he didn't have a moment ago. And if he takes on b5, I have time for the in-between move, e takes f7 check. And after king takes f7, I might have to trade queens here, queen d8, rook d8. But I can take back on b5, and I think for now I'm up a pawn. It's kind of scary though. I mean, Black's pieces become active very quickly, bishop b4 check and rook e8, and I wouldn't be surprised if a computer says that white has no advantage here at all. But the point is I should have seen this variation during the game and considered it. I played queen d4. Mike played e takes d5, and it's a good idea, as I mentioned before, when your opponent has a big pawn center, to try to break it down. And that's what Mike's doing now. E takes d5, and then he played queen e7 check. I didn't think this was going to be a good move, because it blocks the bishop on f8. But, as I mentioned before, the c5 square is a little bit weak for white. And after my bishop e2, which develops a piece, when I eventually castle kingside, Black will have the option several times in a row of trading queens with queen c5, which may help him equalize the game. Bishop d7 from Mike, and I kind of like this move. In some variations, I was playing bishop to b5 check and causing problems by doing that. So bishop d7 blocks that check and prepares to castle queenside. I think the bishop would be more active on f5 or g4, but after castle kingside, that would potentially open Black up to a bishop e5 check. Castle kingside from me. Obviously I want to get my king off of the file that his queen is occupying, and I would like to replace it with a rook when I'll have threats against his queen and king. But Mike castled queenside. And now it's pretty clear that the players are going to be attacking on opposite wings. White's going to try to attack the Black king on c8, and Black's going to, maybe I shouldn't have said opposite wings actually, because Black's going to be trying to find counterplay in the center against White's center pawns and maybe along the e-file as a way of equalizing the game. And in fact, right now, Black is threatening either bishop e6 or bishop c6, putting 3 attackers on the d5 pawn at a time when it's hard for me to defend it with another piece. I really don't want to play bishop to c4, as that will cost me my light squared bishop potentially. So I instead tried to take advantage of the fact that black's king's on c8 instead of b8, and that for that reason the pawn on a7 is weak, by playing a4, intending a5 to kick the knight away, after which I can take on a7 with my queen. This is a pretty normal idea. When you see a knight on one of these four squares, b6, b3, g6, or g3, it can be a very good idea to advance your rook pawn twice, kicking that piece away, which may or may not win material, but at least allows you to advance that rook pawn with tempo, which usually makes that idea go from being not a good one to worth it or even advantageous. Okay, so I played a4, Mike played bishop e6, and I, in my opinion, from, let's say, maybe from his move e6 on, from the 8th move on, Mike plays this game pretty darn well, well above his 1728 rating. I played a5, looking to get the knight away from the queen side so that I can take on a7. Mike kind of calmly takes on d5, and he is going to make use of this queen c5 in order to keep queen a7 from being any kind of significant threat. I played queen takes a7, and he played queen c5 check, forcing the trade of queens. And it's not so good for white here anymore. I think at one point white had a significant advantage, but it's starting to look like the tables have turned. I kind of wanted to try bishop to e3 when black can win a piece with knight takes e3, but that gives me time to play queen a8 check, king d7, but here I don't have any more decent checks. In fact, I can't even sacrifice a rook on d1, hoping to check with the other one when I recapture, because knight takes d1 comes with check. So I had to trade queens on c5, and now after bishop takes c5 check and king h1, black has developed all of his minor pieces and one of his rooks. Has done so with tempo because he has the next move, and white is going to have problems with this bishop on c1. It just has no good squares to be developed too. Mike, on top of that, is able now to take my f4 pawn, which means he's not only going to be more active, he's going to be up a pawn. And all I really have in exchange for that is a6 with hopefully a queenside attack. But I don't think there's much to that if black plays well from this point on. So I'm pretty confident that black has an edge here, though I'll have to check with a computer after the game, after this review of the game, to make sure. Mike played knight g takes f4. I was expecting knight d takes f4 because I thought the e5 square might turn out to be important later on, and he might like to have a knight on g6, preventing my knight on f3 from making use of it. But after knight g takes f4, Mike keeps open the option of using the e3 square or taking this knight on c3. So I don't think there's anything wrong with knight g takes f4, and it might even be better than what I would have played. And yeah, things are looking kind of bad here for white. Black has just taken a pawn and threatened the bishop on e2 in the process. And if black gets the two bishops in addition to his extra pawn and better development, he should have a significant advantage. In fact, should probably be technically winning. I looked for a while at trying to figure out how I could make use of this double attack on f4 by moving my f3 knight away, but couldn't find anything. And things are already not looking like they're going to work out for white tactically here. I thought about knight takes d5, and if black responds with a recapture on d5, which would have to be with his knight, otherwise he drops a piece on f4, then white has temporary reprieve from the pressure he was under and maybe can continue to attack on the queen side with a6. But after knight takes d5, whoops, black can play knight takes e2. and this knight has nothing to capture to continue the chain of captures. It's probably going to have to retreat, and then black can always retreat his knight on e2, although he doesn't even need to because it's not being threatened right now. And again, black has the two bishops and is up a pawn and has better development and is technically winning. I also considered bishop takes f4, which would have relieved me of the problem of the undeveloped bishop on c1, but would have given black the two bishops. And after knight takes f4, I'd have been threatened with going down two bishops for two knights with an open center, which is a Chessic death sentence. So I searched and searched and finally found something else, which I'm glad I took the time to find. That's knight e4. This hangs the bishop on e2, but it threatens the bishop on c5. So, of course, if black takes on e2, I'm going to take on c5. And there's something important to recognize about the knight on c5, which is that it's controlling squares the black king might otherwise have access to, which means that, after a6 and a trade of pawns, white may be threatening rook a8 checkmate. And if black tries knight to e3, threatening the rook on f1, it turns out white is winning, but it took me a long time to see something obvious here, which is that after knight takes c5, knight takes f1, white has bishop takes f4. And after knight takes c5, if knight takes e2, bishop takes e3 is even better. So we can't do that, but perhaps Mike should have simply retreated the dark squared bishop somewhere, because what he actually did is play bishop e3, and while that solves some tactical issues, it eventually allows the trading of white's undeveloped bishop on c1 for its counterpart on the other side of the board. It allows white to trade pieces, narrowing the activity deficit without giving up the two bishops. I played bishop to c4. I think taking here, bishop takes e3 is not a very good move, because after knight takes e3, black is threatening the rook on f1 and the bishop on e2, and is still up a pawn. So I played bishop to c4, getting my bishop out of danger, as black did on the previous move. And now if this knight moves away, perhaps I'll play bishop takes e6 check, maybe at a time when black is unable to recapture with his knight, which might force him to take back with his f-pawn, which might give me a weakness to target on e6, which might partially compensate me for being down material. But more importantly than that, the tables are sort of turning once again. Black had a significant advantage because of extra material and better piece activity. But now the white pieces are becoming significantly more active and are no longer being threatened by the black ones. And if these white knights can continue to improve by heading to the c5 and e5 squares, they're going to start putting a lot of pressure on the area around black's king, which could result in white winning material. Mike played bishop takes c1, and I rejected rook a takes c1 pretty quickly because knight e3 is a fork, and while that fork doesn't win material or even win a bishop, because bishop takes e6 check is possible as an in-between move. After knight takes e6, white has to move this rook on f1, whereas after rook f takes c1, that extra move with the rook is not forced, so if knight e3, bishop takes e6, something takes e6, white has a move here with which to continue his queenside attack. But Mike played h6, and this is maybe the first, I don't know whether or not to call it a major strategic mistake or not, but the first move after which I was confident I was back in the game and playing for an advantage. And that's because things are have been pretty tactical, pretty complicated so far, and the pieces have been swarming around the center. And the players have to play with initiative, they have to play with energy, or they're going to give up the advantage pretty quickly, or give up equality. When Mike plays h6, he's taking the g5 square away from the white knights, but he's not taking the e5 and c5 squares away. So this is too slow a defensive move for the situation, and allows white to once again play with an edge. I played knight to c5, and again I want to play a6 at some point, and whether I take on b7 or there's an exchange on a6, there might be this threat of rook a8 checkmate, which will hopefully win material. So Mike played king b8. It's good. In general, when you castle queenside, you want to move your king to the b file sooner than later. And here, black is going to defend against the queening of the a pawn with his king, which I think is a good idea. I played a6, but I had to make a calculation before playing this move because it opens up the possibility of black playing knight b6, which is what Mike played in the game. This move is a double attack on c4, and it guards the a8 square, which otherwise might be available to the white rook on a1 after a capture on b7. But it turns out that after a takes b7, black isn't actually threatening to win a piece on c4. If the knight takes, then rook a8 is immediately checkmate. And if the bishop takes, as in the game, white can play rook takes c4, when again knight capture on c4 would allow checkmate. And here black has the option of trying to get out of this troublesome situation on the queen side with tactics by playing rook d1 check. And after rook takes d1, knight takes c4, because there isn't currently a rook a8 checkmate. And during the game I was thinking that, at least for a while, I was thinking that I'd play rook a1 here, intending rook a8, forcing the knight back to b6, and then I'd continue to advance my knights in the center and attack. But I think it turns out that rook d4 here just wins a piece, as the knights are forked on c4 and f4. So Mike had to play a different move here, and he elected to go for knight e6, which is a decent idea. He wants to trade off one of white's attacking pieces, in fact probably the most important white attacking piece, as it is guarding the pawn on b7 and looking at the e7 square and a6, threatening things in all sorts of different variations. But by playing knight e5, I brought my last piece into the attack and threatened knight c6 check. And I think at this point white is probably once again in an extremely advantageous or even winning position. Mike played knight takes c5. I threw in knight c6 check, forcing king takes b7, and then knight takes d8 check, rook takes d8, rook takes f5, leaves white up in exchange for a pawn. And with so many open files, and with pawns on both sides of the board, this position I'm confident is technically winning for white. Mike, though, continued to put up very stubborn resistance and got very close to a draw in several variations, which I'll show you as we go along. Rook to d2 from Mike, threatening this pawn on b2. Rook a to c1, trying to defend actively by threatening c7, after which f7 and g7 will be threatened. So Mike has to defend that pawn with knight to d5. But now the knight has to be protected by the rook on d2, so rook takes b2 is not really threatened. I played king g1, getting my king out of the corner and getting rid of the possibility of a back rank checkmate. King b6 from Mike. I kind of like this move. I mean, he has to do something, and he can't move his knight off of d5, and his rook's pretty well positioned on d2. So he is getting his king off of the 7th rank, so that if there's ever a rook takes c7, it won't come with check. It's clear, though, I think at this point, that if black's best option is a slight improvement of his king, like king b6, white's going to win eventually with good play, and that's because black's pieces are in just about the best positions they can be in, and there's nothing for him to do to recover his material or to get some kind of compensating advantage in another area. Rook c6 check. I thought either black would go back to the 7th rank, in which case a later rook takes c7 may come with check, or he'd come up the board, which would remove one of the defenders from the c6, the c7 pawn. King to b5, and rook 6 to c2, offering black a trade of rooks. This rook is restricting the mobility of my king and has the potential to combine with the knight to cause problems, to achieve some kind of fork or win a pawn somewhere. So I'd love to trade rooks and then use my other rook to try to start gobbling up black's remaining pawns. Understanding that, Mike played rook d3, which I think is a very good move. I played king f2, improving my king, and he played king b4. Alright, so black doesn't really have much to do here. He's going after the pawn on b2 with the king, which makes sense, but brings with it the problem that afterwards, like even if black successfully takes this pawn, it'll often be in exchange for his c-pawn, and afterwards, because the rooks are on the c-file, the king will be cut off from the rest of the board, and therefore unable to assist his pieces in the defense of the f7, g7, and h6 squares. But white needs some way to try to force a rook trade. Otherwise, it's difficult to make progress. So I decided to play rook e1, intending rook e2, and then some rook to the d-file, at which point black will have to trade, because moving the rook away, even if possible at that point, would hang the knight on d5. f6 from Mike, rook e2, rook d4. Okay, so Mike obviously sees that I'm going to try to trade rooks, so he moves his rook up to the 4th rank, with the idea that he can escape to f4 with check. And it's possible that rook e to d2 is a good way to go here for white. And after rook f4 check, if I play king g3, black has 2 pieces being threatened, but he can defend them both with rook to f5, and he's continuing to hold on. But I really wanted that rook off of the board, so I played g3 first to take away the f4 square, intending rook ed2 next. c5 from black, rook ed2, and now the rooks are coming off the board. King b3, going after this b2 pawn. I think it's a good idea. Rook takes d4. Black, of course, can't play king takes c2 because he would hang the knight on d5. So he plays c takes d4. And rook d2 threatens to grab this pawn on d4. And black cannot afford to exchange these 2 pawns, frankly, because afterwards the black king will still be cut off on the queen side. And white's rook and king will team up to start picking off these black pawns while defending their own pawns against the knight. King c4, king e2, f5 from Mike. f5 I think is a decent move. If I had played king to f3 intending king e4, f5 would have been played anyway, I believe, so that's why I went to e2. And here rook c2 check forces the king away. In fact, it forces him back to the b-file, and I thought afterwards I could play rook c5 or rook c8 and start getting behind black's pawns and picking them off. But after king b3, I realized that rook d2 was likely to force the black king back to c4. And since Mike was, I guess, somewhat short on time at this point, with about 10 minutes left on his clock, I figured if I could cost him even a little bit of that time, it would be a good idea for me. So I played rook d2, he played king c4, and it's possible to repeat here with rook c2 check and then invade. But I saw something else here, which is b3 check. I think black probably should have played king c5, trying to hold on to this d-pawn. My intention was to meet that with rook c2 check, followed by an invasion. If the king goes to b4 here, then rook c4 check picks off the pawn on d4. Instead, Mike took on b3, and I played rook takes d4. And the queenside pawns have been traded, which is a plus for black, but what is very bad for him in the long run is the fact that this white rook is preventing the black king from rejoining the action on the king side and providing any kind of assistance to the knight. Mike played knight f6, I improved the king f3, king c3, rook d8, of course keeping the rook on this file to keep the black king hemmed in, king c4, king f4, knight g4. And to my dismay here, I realized that there are variations in which black seems to be coming away with a draw. Notice that if all the pawns disappear from the board, we have rook versus knight, and in that situation, as long as the knight doesn't get trapped and is able to make it back to his king, the game's going to be drawn, at least with good play. So I was trying to avoid variations in which all three of black's pawns got traded for my two. And there were a couple of those here. For example, king takes f5, knight takes h2, king g6, knight f1 threatens the g3 pawn. I have no way to defend it with the rook, so I would have to play g4. But then black can play knight to e3, threatening that pawn again. And again, I have no way to defend it with the rook, so I'd either have to allow it to be captured, which should cause the game to end in a draw, or I'd have to move back and defend it with the king, which calls into question the move king g6 to begin with. And after h3, as I played in the game, Mike goes knight f2, and now if I play king takes f5, which looks like a little bit better version than the last one, he can play knight takes h3, and then after king to g6, knight to f2, king takes g7, knight e4, we've got a similar problem with the g-pawn. It can't be defended by the rook, and if g4, knight f2 hassles it again, and it still can't be defended by the white rook. So there would at least be the possibility of a draw here for black. But I spent enough time here that I finally found what I think is a winning idea. I played h3, knight f2, h4. And what I want to do, of course, is take this pawn on f5, maybe even play the move h5 in order to keep this pawn on g7, and just try to keep the white pawns around for long enough to trade one of them for all three of black's pawns. Mike played knight e4, and I finally found, I think, a winning variation here that initiates the sequence of captures. I played king takes f5, knight takes g3 check, and king g6. And unlike in those other variations, it turns out to be very difficult for black to attack white's remaining pawn. He played h5, which is another attempt at a draw. Mike played this game extremely well, in my opinion. Now after king takes g7, he would play knight f5 check and pick off this pawn on h4. So I played rook d7 instead, looking to take the pawn with my rook. King c5 from black. Rook takes g7. King d6, and the king is starting to rejoin the action, but a rook is much faster at getting over to the king side, of course, than a king. So it's just black's king's not going to be in time. Rook f7, with the idea to play rook f3, scare the knight away, and grab the pawn on h5. King e5, rook f3, knight e4, king takes h5. And so that's a successful trade by white of one of his pawns for all three of black's, which makes this position able to be won, sometimes even if these pieces are traded for each other, because the pawn can queen. I say sometimes, though, because this is a rook pawn. So, for example, after black's knight f6 check, white can't just trade on f6. King takes f6, as this position is drawn. Those of you who are familiar with basic endgame theory may be aware that if black's king can reach any one of these squares against a rook pawn, he has no problem drawing the game. King to g6 instead, knight to g8, and here I found a way to finish the game that I think is pretty good. I played rook f7, cutting off the knight's remaining escape square. Mike played king e6 to renew the possibility of moving the knight out that way. But I played king g7 anyway, because here if knight e7, I can just play rook takes e7, king takes e7, and h5. So in this position, after king to g7, Mike resigned. But an extremely well played game by him, and he seems like he's a significantly stronger player than he was when I played him a couple of years ago. So great job to him, and I am not looking forward to the next time I play him. I'm at 3 out of 3 in the tournament, so is Roger Capello, so I will have board 1 with the black pieces against him next week. Thanks a lot.